بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله محمد.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the nearest area in which to look for the source of the Qur'an. It is here that investigation should proceed, because here the truth will be determined. When we have a causal relationship between two different matters, so as whenever one takes place, the other materializes, then a proper investigation of that relationship will show us the true cause of the effect we have. Let us now consider that phenomenon. Was it deliberately affected, even as a preparatory means to achieve higher concentration, or was it something entirely involuntary? If the latter, then was it induced by any normal situation, such as lethargy or drowsiness, or an abnormal one, such as mental disturbance, or was it a reaction to something totally external? A glance at the components of that phenomenon is sufficient to show that it could never have been the result of affectation. This is even more apparent when we reflect on the aspect of babbling noises heard near the Prophet ﷺ's face. Moreover, if such a condition was affected, it would easily have been resorted to at any time. Whenever he wished to have more of the Qur'an, Muhammad ﷺ would have been able to produce it by resorting to this method of preparation. Thus the Qur'an would be available to him at will. However, we know that on the many occasions when he desperately needed it, he could only receive it when God willed that it be revealed. Hence, it was clearly an involuntary process. If we look at it again, we find that it is in no way like the drowsiness we experience when we are in need of sleep. The Prophet ﷺ experienced this condition in all situations, sitting or standing, walking or riding, morning and evening, and even when he was talking to others, whether they were friends or opponents. It came all of a sudden and went just as suddenly. It lasted for only a very brief period. It was not gradual like lethargy. Furthermore, it was accompanied by those strange noises which were not heard from him or from anyone else when they went to sleep. This is a condition so unlike that of sleep in all its aspects, times, and features. Hence, it is a totally strange condition. We also find it totally unlike any episode of mental illness or of fits and seizures, for these are normally accompanied by loss of color, cold limbs, chattering teeth, involuntary exposure of parts which a person would rather remain unseen, and mental blackouts. The difference, as we have seen earlier, is that Muhammad ﷺ's experience involved increased physical strength, brightness of color, increased body warmth, and resulted in giving light and knowledge. In fact, every time it produced compelling wisdom, which the human mind readily accepts, an external source. We are nearly there, but we will pause a little to determine the source of this light that appeared occasionally, with the man emanating it having no say as to when it would appear. Could it originate from the nature of Muhammad ﷺ's soul? If so, it would have been a permanent light that shines all the time, and it would have been more likely to shine when Muhammad ﷺ was fully alert or engaged in deep thought, instead of coming only in brief spells when he was under that thin cloud which might have seemed like sleep or loss of consciousness. The inevitable conclusion then is that this thin cloud must have had a source of light beyond, which focused on Muhammad ﷺ's soul every now and then, elevating him to a sublime horizon that transcended his senses and imparted to him whatever God willed of knowledge. Thereafter, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned to his normal state, having acquired new knowledge that he had not had before, the whole process being repeated time after time. We all be
Jazakallahu khairan.
awaykum wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad.
God says, there is none in the heavens and the earth, but he comes to the compassionate one as a servant. Verily, he knows their number and has counted them precisely. And each one of them will come to him on the day of resurrection, each one alone. Truly, those who believe and perform righteous deeds, from them the compassionate one shall appoint love. For them the compassionate one shall appoint love. This is no doubt this no doubt holds true in both this world and the hereafter. For in the Holy Quran we see that Joseph alayhi salam said that being in prison where he would be alone and free to worship God would be more lovable to him and not simply ultimately better for him than the adulterous embraces of beautiful women. He said, my Lord, prison is more lovable to me than to which they are urging me, and if you do not fend off their wiles from me, I shall turn towards them and become of the ignorant. However, in the Holy Quran, the beauty of loving, remembering, and worshipping God in isolation is perhaps characterized most by the person of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who, whilst worshipping God within the sanctuary alone as a child, was miraculously given as a divine grace summer fruits in winter and winter fruits in summer, and provision without reckoning. God says her Lord accepted the child with gracious acceptance and made her grow excellently, and Zechariah took charge of her. Whenever Zechariah went into sanctuary where she was, he found her with provisions. O Mary, he said, whence comes this to you? She said, from God. Truly God provides for whomever he will without reckoning. Of course, not every believer is given supernatural graces and experiences like the Blessed Virgin Mary, but nevertheless, every believer can, by God's leave, attain both serenity of heart and God's spirit of peace through love of God and through the remembrance and worship of God. God says, those who believe and whose hearts are reassured by God's remembrance, verily, by God's remembrance, our hearts reassured. He it is who sent down the spirit of peace into the hearts of the believers that they may add faith to their faith, and to God belongs the hosts of the heavens and the earth, and God is ever knower wise. Thus, when the believer devotes himself or herself to God with complete devotion, he or she eventually but inevitably becomes completely satisfied and indeed utterly delighted with what God has given him or her. For God says, if only they had been content with what God and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have given them, and had said, sufficient for us is God. God will give us from His favor, and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam will also give us. To God we are suppliants. Does God not suffice His servant? Yet they would frighten you of those besides Him, and whomever God leads astray, for him there is no guide. This is the state, and God knows best, wherein God purchases the soul of the believer in return for paradise and the supreme triumph. God says, indeed, God has purchased from the believers their lives and their possessions, so that theirs will be the reward of paradise. They shall fight in the way of God, and they shall kill and be killed. That is a promise which is binding upon him in the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran. And who fulfills his covenant better than God? Rejoice then in this bar in this bargain of yours which you have made, for that is the supreme triumph. In this state, the believer also becomes one of those who truly follow the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the extent that they are considered to be with the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Muhammad is the messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and those who are with him are hard against the disbelievers, merciful amongst themselves. You see them bowing, prostrating in worship. They seek favor from God and beatitude. Their mark is on their faces from the effect of prostration, that is, their description in the Torah and their description in the Gospel is as a seed that sends forth its shoot and strengthens it, and it grows stout and rises firmly upon its stalk, delighting the sowers, so that he may enrage the disbelievers by them. God has promised those of them who believe and perform righteous deeds forgiveness and a great reward. In this state also the believer loves God ardently, as one ought to love one's Lord. None but the believer can have such a love or reach its degree of ardor. Um, God says, yet there be people who take to themselves rivals besides God, loving them as God is loved, but those who believe love God more ardently. If those who did evil could but see, as they shall when they behold the chastisement, that power altogether belongs to God, and that God is terrible in chastisement. God summarizes this kind of love and all it entails in the following Quranic verse. Truly, those who believe and perform righteous deeds, for them the compassionate one shall appoint love. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد. بسم الله محمد.
Conclusion. By understanding the need to document every verse, the Muslim community, already swelling with the ranks of Huffaz, was setting up both an aid to memorization and a barrier to shield the text from corruptive influences. Even the grind of Meccan oppression could not dampen this resolve, and when the Muslims at last enjoyed the prosperity of Medina the entire nation, literate and illiterate alike, took this task to heart. At the center of this nation resided its energizing focal point, the final messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, dictating, explaining, and arranging every verse through the divine inspiration which was his privilege alone, till all the pieces were in place and the book was complete. How the sacred text fared after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's death, and how the nation shunned complacency and exerted renewed efforts to ensure the Quran's integrity are the focuses of our next chapter. Chapter 6. The written compilation of the Quran. Though the Prophet ﷺ enlisted all possible measures to preserve the Quran, he did not bind all the surahs together into one master volume, as evidenced by Zayd bin Thabit's statement that the Prophet ﷺ was taken from this life whilst the Quran had not yet been gathered into a book. Note the usage of the word gathered rather than written. Commenting on this, Al-Khattabi says, this quote refers to the lack of a specific book with specific traits. The Quran had indeed been written down in its entirety during the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime, but had not been collected together, nor were the surahs arranged. Setting up a master volume might have proved challenging. Any divine abrogation revealed subsequently, affecting the legal provisions and wordings of certain verses, would have required proper inclusion, and a loose page format greatly simplified the insertion of new verses and new surahs, for the revelations did not cease until a short time before the Prophet ﷺ's death. But with his death, the Wahi ended forever. There would be no more verses, abrogations, or rearrangements, so that the situation lent itself perfectly for the compilation of the Quran into a single unified volume. No hesitation was felt in arriving at this decision. Prudence compelled the community to hasten in this task, and Allah guided the companions to serve the Quran in such fashion as to fulfill his promise of forever preserving his book. We have without doubt sent down the message, and we will assuredly guard it from corruption. Compilation of the Quran during Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's reign. Appointment of Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu anhu as compiler of the Qur'an. Zayd reports, Abu Bakr sent for me at a time when the Yamama battles had witnessed the martyrdom of numerous companions. I found Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anhu with him. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu began, Umar has just come to me and said, in the Yamama battles, death has dealt most severely with the Qur'an, and I fear it will deal with them with equal severity in other theatres of war. As a result of the Qur'an, as a result, much of the Qur'an will be gone. I am therefore of the opinion that you should command the Qur'an to be collected. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh continued, I said to Omar, how can we embark on what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam never did? Omar radiallahu anh replied that it was a good deed regardless, and he did not cease replying to my scruples until Allah reconciled me to the undertaking, and I became of the same mind as him. Zayd, you are young and intelligent. You used to record the revelations for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we know nothing to your discredit. So pursue the Qur'an and collect it together. By Allah, had they asked me to move a mountain, it would not have been weightier than what they requested of me now. I asked them how they could undertake what the Prophet ﷺ had never done. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anh and Umar radiallahu anh insisted that it was permissible and good. They did not cease replying to my scruples until Allah reconciled me to the undertaking, the way Allah had already reconciled Abu Bakr and Umar. On being convened, Zayd accepted the momentous task of supervising the committee, and Umar, who had proposed the project, agreed to lend his full assistance. Zayd bin
جزاك
Thabit.
الله خيرا محمد وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد.